Welcome to Campus Conversations, brought to you by UCL Student Success Team, your go-to podcast for all things about student life at University College London. We're back for Season 2, and today we'll be talking about modern society and culture change. I'm Amman, and I'm a fourth year medic.
I'm Mubaraq, and I'm a second year law student.
I'm Kat, and I'm a first year geography student.
As I said, today we're talking about modern society and culture change. We got a bunch of cards on the table with some news bits and questions to do with them. So, are you ready? Let's get into it. So first up, here's our new segment. Research discussed in The Guardian argues that claiming colourblindness, i.e. I don't see race, can actually correlate with higher levels of both implicit and explicit racial bias. According to psychologists, colourblind ideology can be framed as unity, but it may also mask division and prevent honest conversations about inequality. The question is colourblindness an aspirational ideal or a way of denying racism, colorism and prejudice? That's a big one to get into, isn't it?
A charged question.
Yeah. What do you think of the term colourblindness to start with then, I guess? Do you like it? Do you disagree with it?
I think colourblindness is a way for people to ignore the issue that's going on, and it's a way for people to think that we can just erase the structures and the structural ways that society is existing just by pretending that it's not there. And I think that concept really favours the white majority as a way of them not having to talk about difficult conversation, what they might find uncomfortable, for them to be like, you know what, I can take a step back. This doesn't concern me. It's uncomfortable for me to talk about. Let me not, because I don't see colour. I think in British context especially, it's like them saying I'm colourblind is a way of them thinking, oh, I'm not racist. And that's like my way of putting it out that I'm not racist, just by saying, oh, I see everyone as the same. But by saying that, you're almost immediately devaluing someone, you're ignoring lived experiences. And it's like, so what exactly are you bringing by saying I'm colourblind and I don't see race? What do you think?
I think that makes sense. I think the way I've always seen that topic is, I think when people think of racism is always a really big, scary word, but I really don't think it is. I think it starts off with when we define racism. So it's really seeing a race as subpar to you. Racism, I think a lot of people take racism to mean to see different races or to understand there's difference. I think there are noticeable differences between people of different races just because of different cultural elements, different lived experiences, and just generally how life is, how the cookie crumbles essentially. Black people, white people, brown people, they tend to have different experiences because of a history that we're not going to get into. But I think, so when people say they're colourblind, I feel like they think they're fixing the problem of racism by essentially claiming they don't see any difference. But I think that's not what anti-racism is trying to tackle. Anti-racism is trying to tackle seeing a difference in a negative way, believing that you are above another person. I think that's the issue. So that's why I don't think saying you're colourblind fixes the issue, because you're just saying you don't see difference at all, which is not what anybody's asking you to do. You can notice the difference between a white person and a black person, but it's about being able to recognise that their differences, though there's differences, they're still equal.
Yeah. I think the way they worded it here with aspirational ideal, that's the perfect descriptor of it. They think that it's this perfect solution. It's this, oh, there's no racism, I don't see colour. But it's the fact that it's how you're responding to that race difference between people. And it makes a big point of implicit bias, and I've personally experienced that a lot recently within actual medical placements and stuff. And I feel like people just have no awareness of how much unconscious bias each of us has every day. As an example, so in medicine we are in firms where we're in a small group and we do all our teaching with them. We go on wards together, and mine is me and 4 white people. So it's a very interesting racial configuration to go into the world with. And I've noticed that a lot of the doctors don't look at me as much as they look at the white people in my groups. And I think that's where they might be thinking they have a colourblind approach. They might not be seeing the colour, but that's the point of addressing racism as a real thing, where because it's so ingrained into the society and the things we do have these implicit biases, and we do treat people differently because of it. So when people use colourblindness as a solution, you're not fixing anything, you're just letting yourself continue to do what you're doing.
I think it's exactly the point that Mubaraq said, the opposite of racism is not now being colourblind, it's being anti-racist. So I think people just thinking that they can embrace this ideology of, yes, I'm colourblind and I don't see race, it just completely dismisses the other side of what we're actually trying to tackle and talk about.
What does anti-racism actually look like in society? How do we get to a point where that is what we're doing?
I think anti-racism can only really be directly addressed one of two things. I think accountability, and then 2, I think exposure. So I mean that to say that I don't think you can have a real understanding of, for instance, black people and like different, their experiences. I'm not going to say struggle, like their achievements, etc. Like just things that are very specific to black people, for instance, unless you interact with not just one black person, but several. And I feel like that has to occur naturally, like just as you walk through life. So I think a way of doing that is really that diversity. But oftentimes people hear diversity and they're thinking, oh, okay, DI, like force a black person into your office or into the workplace. But that's not what it is. I think you can become anti-racist if you engage with the world. So that can be things like changing the type of literature that you read, reading from the narratives of different people that aren't similar to you. I think you can learn a lot without ever interacting with a person, but a lot of people aren't honest with themselves and they don't go on that pursuit of knowledge in a broad sense. So even if we think about things like the curriculum, obviously there's endeavors to make it more diverse, but a lot of the voices that we hear, Shakespeare, I don't know, like who else? Charles Dickens, these like white men, obviously who great at their job. Like I'm not saying they didn't do a good job, but there's definitely a conversation to be had when a lot of the things that we learn center white culture. And that's not to say that white culture is necessarily bad. Like obviously we're in Britain naturally, but I think there's value as well in hearing from other people and hearing from other experiences.
I think a characteristic that people need to show more, and I feel like that some people lack, is humility. I think that idea of like being humble and just taking that step back. I think you need to be able to hear people out. You need to be able to listen, and then, like you said, reading literature, engaging with people, that exposure. But none of that is going to work unless you have some humility and you're willing to accept and you're willing to learn, rather than just thinking, yeah, it's just me in the world. And it's like, that's really not how the world works. So I think it's that concept of being humble in order to discover more about different people and just be willing to learn and accept like you're not the only person in this world, and like that's just not how it's going to run. I think that's an example.
It's kind of like it always like feeds. Then the step backwards to that is you need more people of diverse backgrounds in art, making TV, making the books, Then you also need them in curriculum, making the lessons that we do, and then go back and you need them in university, getting those positions, and then you go back to this podcast where it's student success who are getting diverse people into university. So it's like, it seems like such a small thing, but then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So do you think in our lifetime any of this will be something? In our lifetime, where do you think the balance is going to shift? Looking that far ahead.
The thing is, I think racism especially is really specific in that, like, I wouldn't say Britain as at large is a racist country, right? I feel pretty welcome in a lot of the spaces that I'm in. Like, I generally have pretty positive experiences. So I really do think it shifts now, I think nowadays, from like a system-wide issue to now personal. So I think nowadays it's less about policy, even though there's still issues in that realm, but your everyday. Are you being the type of person that's open to other people? Are you perpetuating certain stereotypes and racism individually? So I think when we ask the question of, do we feel like racism in the near future will be erased? I don't necessarily think there's one true answer. I think it's really dependent on the people that you interact with and the type of person they are as well. I think racism nowadays starts to look a lot more context dependent.
It's a hard question. I don't know why I asked it. Because I agree, it's very much like, in this space, maybe it'll be less. Maybe in this space, it'll end up going up. Like, I like to hope that by the time I'm a doctor, I won't be treating different med students differently based on where they come from and what type of person they are. And it's about like being in those positions to make that change. Then, yeah.
I think that's so difficult because we're now taking it as groups, right? So I'm saying that if I'm as an individual and I'm like, take us as a group, and yes, we're understanding and accepting, and we hope that this group is as well. But what about half the other groups that aren't? So we're hoping that, yes, like these groups are going to become the same way that we are, but are they not? So that's how the question's feeling like it's this ambitious ideal, however they phrase it, because it's like we hope that we would judge people based on character rather than race, but is that just us trying to be aspirational? Yeah. Will that actually come like into tangible ways rather than just, for example, it might also be performative. Think about like corporate places, like a lot of that is, oh yeah, we're diverse and we're inclusive, but oh yeah, actually, is that how you're presenting yourself? In the same way that a person might say, yeah, I'm inclusive and my friends are this and I'm not this because my friends are that. It's like, but you're putting on a performance that is like deep inside, like, are you actually? So will that now ever mean that something will change? I don't know.
Well, I think for me, racism has looked very, very like I feel like it's changed as I've grown up and like moved into different spaces. So like at UCR, I personally don't think I've experienced any sort of racism from anyone, but I think that just comes with the people at UCR tend to be more educated. So on that front, my experiences have been pretty good. I guess in like sixth form and secondary school, I think the demographics there were different. So naturally, there was different characters, you know, and for me, I think a lot of it comes down to training. Like I always used to say back then at the time that the schools I went to, the staff didn't necessarily have the right training to deal with like the racial matters at hand. But I think that's the biggest thing. I think oftentimes staff don't know how to deal with something, so they'll rather turn a blind eye to it. And I think that in turn leads to more and more racism, but only like you end up having to shoulder the burden of trying to fix that or sort it out. But yeah, I would say it's a staff issue rather than like kids. I feel like kids will make mistakes, so I think it's the burden's on the staff to make those those implementations in terms of change and policy.
Yeah, I forgot that. Like mine's very like distinctly pre-university, after university, where I came from Bradford, and Bradford is very, very brown. Like my school was 99% of brown people, so I encountered no racism at all as I was growing up, and then I got here, and I was like, oh, the world's a bit different than when I grew up from. And it wasn't that big of an issue until this year, where I'm like actually in the world properly. So I think in preclinical years, where I was just like in university lectures and stuff, it was more like seeing it in terms of like the lecture slides, like when they're teaching us about skin conditions, are they only showing white skin, which they tend to do? Are they like talking about how things present in different groups? Are they using stereotypes to teach us about conditions? Which I think is a big thing that they are working on now. But yeah, then now more recently, it's more of a lived experience of, yeah, you do get treated differently by your race. It was kind of a wake up like realization that, yeah, that isn't just on TV, that isn't just in the books, it actually happens. Mm-hmm.
I have a question for you. So you said in your personal experience when coming to UCL, you feel like you haven't experienced maybe as much as before, or if at all. Then you mentioned this idea of people being here being more educated. So do you think that the sense of being educated equivalates to the sense of you experience, like how is the relationship between more educated people and like you experiencing less or no racism linked, in your opinion?
Yeah, okay. So a big one for me is, I think as I walk through life now that I'm older, for me, whether or not someone is performatively anti-racist or they're truly in their heart not a racist, doesn't really concern me in the sense that as long as this person isn't acting in such a way that feels racist, my experience is the same. So I think when I say people are more educated, I believe people might still be racist and, you know, have PhDs, but I think because they're so educated, they now recognize that that's not an acceptable way to carry themselves in society. So that means the way in which they talk to me and the way in which they interact with me is a lot more controlled. They're less reckless with their words. They're more aware of things like microaggressions. Whereas, so even if their heart, they wanted to say the microaggression, they now know that's an unacceptable thing to say. But that means, regardless of their thought process, I didn't hear the microaggression. But I think people that are less educated about the way race works are more likely to say something reckless, to make you feel uncomfortable in a public setting, to make a weird comment about your hair, your skin, or something like that. So I think that's, like, for instance, I think back to sixth form, my head of year telling me that my hair was unprofessional and then put me in isolation for something like that. Like now at UCL, they understand the ramifications of such an act. So even if they felt, this looks so unprofessional, I don't like the way this looks at all, they would never come and say that because they understand how that's problematic. But my head of year at the time, obviously educated in professionally, but didn't necessarily have the education around racism, so didn't understand the weight of what they were saying to me in that moment.
Mm-hmm. Who do you think is in a position to, for example, establish these things? So, for example, you're talking about your head of year. So how should your head of year become informed about this? And you talked about policies and stuff. How should that be implemented? And on like a daily basis, how do you think individuals should embrace culture and progress in a sense?
So one thing I feel like people tend to jump to is this idea of asking the people involved directly. But it's something that I've always disagreed with, because I feel like when you're at the ages of 16, 14, to me, it's very, very inappropriate to have to take on the burden of educating people as to why something is wrong. Because even at that age, at those ages then, I didn't have the proper words to articulate why something felt wrong at the time. So I feel like it would be the wrong move to have teachers put the burden on me to explain back to you. I think the best way to go about these type of things is, one thing is there's a book written on everything. I don't think there's a book that hasn't been written about something. So there's always other ways to go about it. And if not that, if, for instance, there just happened not to be a book on this at all, like the very small chance there isn't a book, there's always, I feel like, a black professional you can reach out to and say, you know, I work with a certain demographic of kids in X, Y, and Z. Is there any things like growing up you felt that, oh, we could have done differently, or, you know, that we weren't necessarily sensitive to? But I think it's a lazy attempt to then ask the kids, oh, what do you want? How should we do it? What do you think the punishment should be if someone says an inappropriate word to you? That is the wrong move. And I think it's showing about the sense of care that education providers have when they just resort to throw up a quick survey, what do the kids want, rather than doing the intentional work to go and find out what are adults saying. Because the way I would have responded to a question about racism now as a 20-year-old compared to when I was 14 is completely different, and I'm sure it'll be different when I'm 30 as well. I'll have a more nuanced view of the world. But asking a 14-year-old who's only ever been in a classroom, what do you think we should do, is lazy, in my opinion.
Kind of like your point earlier about humility and being willing to do that, and your point about surrounding yourself and seeing those people. It's kind of perfect. That's what you're saying there, is having the humility to surround yourself with people and actually have those conversations. And that is kind of the solution to all of it, isn't it? It's just be with people you can ask those questions, like how you're asking him questions now. Be willing to talk about those things, and then you can find your own solutions.
And I feel like that brings about a point that people are not willing to have those conversations, and that already puts you in a situation where you're not willing to have that conversation, therefore no change is going to be achieved. So I think it is really down to that point of humility and just being open and being able. Also, it's this thing of like being able to admit that you're wrong. I think people are so like concerned about, oh, I have to be right, and what if I say something wrong, or what if this comes across like this, or like how do I do it? But it's like sometimes when you hear that person explain their situation, their experience, their lived experience, it's like you have to accept, oh, like, you know what, I didn't know that, or you know what, oh, there's more I could learn about that, or like there's more I could read about that. And it's like people are not willing to do that, and it's like you're putting yourself in a position where you're willingly choosing to ignore things that are so blatantly in front of you, or like things that like you really should be reading about.
So I guess the conclusion is be humble, don't be racist. Let's move on to the next question then.
Thanks for tuning in to Campus Conversations. We hope you had as much fun listening as we did chatting. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe on our various podcast streaming platforms. The link is in the bio. We'll be back again with more stories, ideas, and debates from across UCL, exploring the people and perspectives shaping our university and world. Until next time on Campus Conversations.